Good afternoon. My name is Adrianna Link, and I am the head of scholarly programs at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to today's virtual discussion with Anna Guerrero on the other side of the archive, lessons from processing the Emil Vichy Papers at the American Philosophical Society. We're really excited to have so many of you with us this afternoon. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the American Philosophical Society resides in what is now known as Philadelphia, which is in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. In recognizing this, the Society expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of the Lenape, as well as that of numerous other Indigenous communities and individuals throughout this continent who have offered guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. Their generosity makes the work of the Society's Library and Museum possible. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and to public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum, collections, and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check out our website, www.amphilsoc.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events, and we'll put that link in the chat. We're using Zoom webinar for today's discussion, so not to worry, you've all been muted. If you do have a question, and we hope you will, please use the Q&A button that's in the center of your navigation bar. So just take a second now to locate that. You can type your question there at any time during today's program, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for conversation and questions with our speaker. We're also excited to offer closed captioning for today's virtual discussion. If you would like to use it, please click on the CC box on the bottom navigation bar of Zoom. That's to the right of the Q&A button. Okay, today's discussion is the capstone of the Society's Jacques Barzun Fellowship for Collections and Programming in the History of Biology, and a celebration of the work of its inaugural fellow, Anna Guerrero, who has been here for the past 4 months, processing the papers of zoologist Emil Vichy. Before I turn things over to her, she's going to give you a great behind-the-scenes tour of the archive, I wanted to say just a few words about the fellowship and some of the thinking behind it. So this fellowship was made possible thanks to a gift from Roger L. Williams, who is a former student of Jacques Barzun, and the French-Greek Endowment Fund at the Wyoming Community Foundation. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with Barzun, he was a French-American historian and professor at Columbia University, who's perhaps best well known for his writing and contributions to cultural history and the history of ideas. Barzun was also an APS member and was elected to membership in 1984. And we'll put a link into the chat for those of you who are curious to learn more about him and his life. In 2020, just as we were beginning to go into our lockdown for the pandemic, the APS's Library and Museum Programming Division, which we affectionately refer to as LAMP, received an opportunity to use a portion of the gift to augment the Society's programming related to the history of science. So the APS's Library and Museum contains a vast collection related to the history of science, with materials ranging in topics from early natural history to astronomy, to the history of DNA, to quantum physics and computing. Our librarian Patrick Spear often refers to this as being everything from Newton to NASA. The APS is also home to the papers of 7 Nobel laureates, as well as the largest collection of Darwin materials outside of Britain. So despite this being one of the Library and Museum's largest and most diverse collection areas, the history of science is also one of the most difficult for us to program, as the topics represented in the APS's collections can often be very technical and therefore sometimes difficult to connect with general audiences. And we'll put a link in the chat so you can get a sense of the breadth of our materials. So in an effort to help increase the visibility of these really fantastic holdings, this past January, programming and collection staff collaborated to launch a 4-month pilot fellowship program that paired a scholar with subject expertise in the history of biology with an unprocessed collection of materials in the field. So the basic idea was to give somebody with deep knowledge of the history of science an opportunity to gain professional experience and to learn more about what goes into processing a collection, and then to in turn work with that person to develop scholarly as well as educational programs that could help connect these materials with multiple audiences. And it took us a little while to figure out the parameters of this fellowship. And I wanted to acknowledge several of my colleagues, including Mike Madeja, who will be joining later in this discussion, as well as Charles Breifenstein, David Gary, Kyle Roberts, and Patrick Spiro, who helped to make this fellowship possible. So with that long introduction aside, and without further ado, I'd like to welcome our inaugural Barzun Fellow, Anna Guerrero, who will be this afternoon's guide to the other side of the archive, and without whom this program would not have been possible. Anna, if you want to appear, I will introduce you. Ana Clemencia Guerrero is a PhD candidate in the Center for Biology and Society at Arizona State University. She studies history and philosophy of biology with special interest in how scientists make and use images of normally invisible entities such as cells and microorganisms. In addition to her training in history and philosophy, Anna makes use of methods from microbiology, scientific illustration, and computational humanities. And with that, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Adriana. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. Okay. Adriana, can you tell me if you can see that? Oh, yes. No, not share. Oh my gosh, let's slideshow. Okay.
Looks good. Yep.
All right, great. So thank you everyone for joining this, as Adriana said, celebratory presentation, mostly highlighting some of the work that I've completed during my tenure as the Barzun Fellow here at the APS. I'm so glad to be joined by Mike and Adriana today, and I think we're going to have a really fun conversation at the end, partly about some of the public programming I've been working on with Mike over the last few weeks that's still in process. Yeah, but before that, we're going to talk about the Vichy Collection. And so this was my first time, working in an archive in great detail, definitely my first time processing a collection. So many things about it were surprising, and I just wanted to share some of that with you guys today. So before I start, I'd like to say that I'm not an Emil Vichy scholar, so I cannot claim to know everything about him or his motivations, but I do know some things about the history of 20th century cell biology, and so I will lend some interpretation to the collection through that viewpoint. My hope is that everyone here today will come away with a sense of the richness and diversity of the kinds of materials in a collection that honestly wasn't very big. I think it was 16 linear feet when we got it, and it's probably condensed down some more since then as I've processed it. And so as a consequence of this breadth and of the kinds of materials in there, I think that hopefully some ideas might start to percolate about the scholarly projects that could happen in the future on material like this. So great. So we'll start here with some background about Emil Vichy, just to set the tone for the rest of the materials. He was born in Switzerland in 1890. It's a great year for microbiology. I just know about that. And he got his PhD in Germany in 1913. And this is important to know because in Germany at that time, zoologists were really interested in learning about how single cells became complex organisms, and then how those complex organisms generate single cells again, and then how those single cells become more organisms, and so on. And so questions about development and differentiation and heredity were sort of all the rage. And so at the same time, an active community of scientists in the United States were inventing their own methods and research programs about similar issues. So in the mid-1920s, Vichy began to explore research opportunities in the United States, sort of prompted by some of those early cell biologists who were working here. And he moved here in 1927 to be a professor of zoology at Iowa State University. And it's there that he would carry out the majority of his research and live the rest of his life, basically. Cool. So honestly, maybe the most surprising thing, and though in retrospect it shouldn't have been very surprising, I expected to learn about Vichy the scientist with all of his materials, but I was very happy to learn about him as a human being. There were many items that sort of showed him as a father and as a husband, and as a friend outside of work to some of his colleagues. So it includes lots of photos and letters from his family. He had 2 kids before he moved to the United States, but then his kids had kids in the United States, so he was also a grandfather here. There's also a really cute collection of Christmas cards, and they were always very long and detailed, and he sent them to his many collaborators. So I think he really liked sending Christmas cards. His papers also included a children's book that he authored. The title translates to On Flowers and Animals, and it is sort of natural history tales from diverse cultures. It's actually illustrated by Vichy's students, and his family believes that Vichy himself might have done some of the illustrations. There are no names labeled anywhere, so it's hard to tell which ones those might be. But it's actually quite interesting that he would do these illustrations. I think Vichy had an affinity for drawing and for observation, which we will see in most of his collection. Also, I think some of his colleagues have written about him historically as being just an annoyingly good artist for someone who had never formally trained. So it was really fun for me to go through his collection as a scientific illustrator myself. And so the collection also includes a really extensive, I think, group of his notebooks from school, from college and grad school. So he was a student of zoology in Germany. And so he would have observed the morphology of many kinds of organisms, probably starting with microorganisms and single-celled organisms. And so I've picked out some images to show everyone, partly because that's sort of what I'm interested in my field of study. But I also would like to show you Vichy's eye for composition, because that's going to be important later. So here I have 2 examples of tiny single-cell organisms that he would have drawn early, and I think they're just kind of interesting, and they show sort of I think pretty basic components of balance and composition. And then he also had I think pretty great skill at doing textures. So like the image on the left, he has this like soft fluffy texture coming off this organism that's very, very hard to do with marker. In the middle, I picked this image because I thought it was a good example of how he could take a single-celled organism that theoretically probably would have looked kind of simple under a microscope, but give it a lot of its own personality. And then the image on the right, there's a lot of landscape characteristics. It's, I don't know if you guys can tell, but for an illustration of an organism, it's just like incredibly balanced. And he's made lots of choices about spacing and about height of certain individual components in it that it's very pleasing to look at in a way that maybe not every observer of that organism would have chosen that view. But I take it to mean that he was quite adept at looking and picking. So here we have examples of a variety of form, and I think these start to show us some of Vichy's early interest. So on the left, we sort of have this differential morphology of monocystis, and it kind of, I take it to mean that he was interested in understanding how these different morphologies presented and how they might develop into one another. And on the right, we have a drawing of Amoeba proteus. And for Vichy, when he was observing it, he probably would have been observing this organism in motion. And it is the motion about this organism that is usually the most striking and was very interesting to cell biologists at this time. To many of them, it seemed like the most alive microorganism because it was so active. And so he's really captured that in sort of this moving, flowing shape here. Finally, we have examples of him drawing cellular division and reproduction and development. And I really love the image on the left. I think of all of the images that I saw, it seemed like he took the greatest care in drawing it. I don't know this for sure, but if I had to guess based on my experience as an artist, the one on the left probably took him the most time of many of the drawings that he produced. And I like to think that he put a lot of care into these because he was very interested in sort of capturing this process of how these cells had achieved these sort of feats of division. And so he would take those interests and he really would run with them for the rest of his career. And so here are images of him finally in Iowa. He's pictured with collaborators and graduate students in the collection. I don't have images of them here, but there are letters from many of the graduate students' family because Vichy took on students from other countries often. And so the letters would basically expressing thanks to Vichy for giving their children a chance at being scientists in the United States, which was nice to see. And so it sort of shows the diversity of the kinds of people who were working in a lab like this at this time. Part of the collection also includes the textbook that Vichy wrote. And so basically by 1955, this would have been towards the later part of Vichy's career. He had been so renowned in his field that he would be asked to write a textbook. There are letters from the press that asked him to do this, saying like, people really want to know about sex and development. I'm sure Vichy was like, okay, whatever. But he wrote this textbook, and he actually, we have here, which is exciting for me, a pretty large collection of all of the preparations for the figures that would go into that textbook, which I think is very rare to have. And I think they're in a pretty intact state. And they're really special because they show process. And so this is like what one of these files in this folder of illustration drafts would look like. So it's kind of these stacked objects. On the top, you have like almost like a parchment paper that has text written on it for captions and for labels. And then in the middle, you have like a clear vinyl sheet that included more organizational labels and like how the figure should be organized in space. And then on the bottom, you have almost like this thick cardstock that are the actual original illustrations for the textbook. And they're very tactile, and you can like feel the bumps of the pen. There's pen in the darker lines, and then there's also graphite. So you could smudge those if you weren't careful. But having such an object, and many of those objects, I think for someone interested in studying the process of illustration and scientific illustration, these are like a really excellent group of materials. And so there's tons of them. I know that Vichy didn't do all of them, but he did do many of them. So it's cool that we have those mock-ups. Here is an example of a figure preparation. So on the left, those were what were contained in the sort of draft folders. And then we actually have the textbook. So it's nice to see how these preparations end up getting put into text and what kind of words they end up getting used to highlight or to illustrate, because it's important to remember that most of what Vichy did was observational. He was watching organism parts change over time. And so the visualizations were very important for showing what he was talking about. Cool. Okay, so besides a textbook, Vichy published approximately 200 scientific papers over his career, which is quite a lot. They dealt with issues of development, differentiation, embryology, and cancer. And sort of the unifying component of all of these studies was that Vichy was particularly interested in learning how hormones affected development, and in many cases of different sort of features of organisms. And so he had many experimental organisms that he worked with during his time. It includes some of the more common rat and mice that people are familiar that scientists work on. He also was working on some amphibians and reptiles and frogs and salamanders, because a lot of traditional embryological studies were done on those kinds of organisms. He also looked at lots and lots of birds. Birds are interesting because their hormones affect their sort of like feather patterns and also their mating patterns. And so hormone effect on those were, I think, pretty easily observable compared to some other organisms. The other thing I think is interesting about birds in Vichy's case is that he was in the Midwest. And so getting birds was actually like pretty reliable and pretty easy. So in the collection, there are lots of letters to bird breeders who he was communicating with in order to get these stocks of birds for his experiments. And so I think this is also a good place to say that Vichy, in some ways, is not a standout, but is a product of his time, in that the way he was studying cell and organismal development had a lot to do with experimentation. That is to say, there's ways to study development and differentiation through just observation, and you can record those observations and you can make claims about it just based on looking. But in the United States, it was becoming more and more common to do actual perturbation of cells, actual manipulation of the structures, in order to understand more about the physiology and how they were developing. And I think that becomes very clear once you see all of the kinds of materials on data that we have in this collection. And so remember, experimentation was an important feature of the work. And in science, sometimes that can look rather gruesome. So that's what we'll see. So the first thing, not so gruesome, but probably the most exciting thing to fall out of the collection, and literally fall out, were a bunch of feathers. And so I open a box and then I take out a folder, but the folder isn't closed correctly. And then suddenly there are feathers all over me and all over the table. And it turns out Vichy was doing studies on how hormones affected bird feather patterns. And those feathers we have, and now they are in envelopes and they won't fall on anyone anymore. But I guess I didn't expect to find feathers in these boxes, and I'm not sure how long they had been there. And I'm not sure that they could be used as sort of data now, but they do have a very rich materiality to them and physicality to them. And so along with the feathers, you have Podochrome film of images. I don't know that you can see very well, but if you look closely, they are sort of the sacrificed birds from which these feathers were probably taken. And so there's like a full documentation of sort of the phenomenon that hormonal changes might have had on bird patterns. And they're rather morbid images. They are of dead birds sort of hanging upside down. But this film would have been very expensive to use and produce at the time, but the color quality of the final images would have been extremely bright and perfect for the kind of things that Vichy was trying to document in terms of color change for hormone effects. There's a lot of documentation of studies of parabiosis, and parabiosis was originally done around the 1850s. And so this is 100 years later, they're still using this technique, which is where you kind of surgically connect the circulatory systems of two organisms. In Vichy's case, it was mice. And by doing this, you can sort of see how physiology changes in one organism might affect the properties or the characteristics of another organism to which it is attached. And so Vichy was interested in how hormones affect secondary sex characteristics, so like gonad development. And so he would put two mice together, male, female, 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 male, male, and then you inject hormones into one mouse, and then you see how that affects the sort of reproductive system or the circulatory system or the functioning of another mouse. And so there's a lot of information about these studies. There's lots of charts measuring like hormone levels and changes in morphology over time. And this was just some of the experimental work that was very important for what he was trying to observe and understand. And so one of the things about Vichy that I found very fascinating, and maybe I think is one of the most valuable things in this collection, starts with this work, which is sex reversal in frogs and amphibians. And so if you expose certain types of frog embryos and certain types of frog embryos to hormones at an early enough stage, late enough that you know theoretically what sex the organism will develop into, whether male or female. But if you intervene at a certain point with hormones, you can actually reverse the sex of it, and you can generate sexual characteristics that you wouldn't necessarily expect based on the chromosomal structure of the embryo that you were working with. And so this is very complicated, but this is the kind of work that gets picked up by the press. And so when Vichy took a bunch of frogs that were theoretically destined to become males and then exposed them to hormones, and then suddenly they're females, the press picks this up in many different avenues, and they pick it up with a world without men, which is super fun, maybe. And these articles sort of outline the research process, but the upshot, even though this is happening in frogs, was, could this potentially happen to people? Do we need men? All of this stuff. And I think it's fascinating that this is the sort of thing that of all of Vichy's work, people would find the most important to share. There are some also really fun things that came out of it, besides just sort of like alarmist articles. So on the left, we have sort of a summary of one of the studies where he showed that if you administer hormones to birds, you can extend their breeding season for a lot longer period of time. They were sort of like lewd, like people find this interesting because people find mating interesting, even though it's about birds. And so people would comment on that. And then my favorite was the one on the right, which is a women's column. And they were writing about Vichy's experiments on frogs that turned them all into female frogs from male frogs. And she was saying basically that if there were no men in the world, then I would have nothing to write about, because men are all the causes of issues for women. And so you can't do this because otherwise I won't have a column, which I thought was quite funny. There's also some issues about sex determination. If Vichy showed in some cases that you could tell sort of what sex an organism might become earlier than people had known before. And so this sort of got picked up as like maybe one day we will be able to not only tell you what it is, but we could modify it early enough in the process that you may choose the sex of your baby. And so this was happening in the 1950s, which in my mind is pretty early, considering we're starting to see sort of that coming out to play in modern times with IVF and sort of genetic modification. So this has been an issue for a while. And I think one of the best things so the articles themselves are interesting in terms of how the newspaper outlets pick them up. But I think even more surprising and potentially fruitful in terms of studies is Vichy received lots of letters from the public based on these sensational articles on all sorts of topics that I think even today we're still grappling with how to deal with them in society. And so, like we just saw, we had articles about sex determination. And so he received letters from men and women, usually concerning, like, I'm a woman, I'm going to have my fourth child. I would like to have a girl, and I've just had boys. I told my doctor, and he said you had an article in the paper concerning this very issue, and he said I should write to you. And so they write to him basically asking, like, is there a way to pick or influence the sex of my baby? There's also a weird letter by a man who basically says, I know how to determine the sex. There's like a process, a whole thing you can do to make sure you get a human baby with the sex that you want. It was kind of a weird letter. I didn't have a picture of it, but these letters are present. It's unclear if Vichy responded to any of them. I haven't seen the responses in any of the correspondence, but maybe they're buried deep in there. But all of these letters were with the newspaper clippings, which I thought meant that somebody found them. They had gone through the extensive correspondence and pulled them out purposefully. And I'm glad they did, because they're quite rich. There are also letters from Eugenesis. So eugenics movements, they've never gone away. They've only changed, but in the 1950s, they were present in the United States. And some of what Vichy's work was concerned with was population control, since he was concerned with sort of human sexual characteristics and the reproduction of organisms. And so eugenicist groups thought that Vichy might be sympathetic to their causes, and they would write him letters, and they would have like kind of wonky scientific studies about what kinds of people should and shouldn't breed, and later say, you don't have to respond, but we thought you might be interested in this, and send to anyone else you think might be interested in this. So weird solicitations, also unclear if Vichy responded to these things. And finally, there was a lot about biological identity in this collection. Partly because Vichy studied scientifically like features of hermaphrodism in people. He, at that time, thought it abnormal and a state of disease, basically, and that it was some sort of like hormones not functioning, and obviously ideas of normal change over time But this sort of gives a very detailed snapshot of the sorts of concepts that people were using in order to talk about sex and gender and biological identity and the kinds of scientific information that you might use to support certain ideas about it. And there were newspaper clippings about people who basically were transgender at the time, who were put in newspapers as sensationalized stories, people that Vichy had nothing to do with, but I think the fact that these clippings were present means that he collected them, so he was interested in this as a topic. Another thing that was in this collection that I think really would benefit from the right kind of scholar, which is not me, but were letters from the public responding to some of his sex reversal newspaper articles saying, I am a man and I have desires to become a woman, basically, and I've always had these, and I don't know if you have any suggestions or if you can tell me more about if there are biological processes for people to do this. And I think those are really incredible to have from this time, and obviously require, again, the right person to look at them and deal with them, and that's not me, but I just really hope everyone knows that these sorts of things would exist in a collection from this time. Great. So cool. That is the end of sort of that part of my time here. Those are sort of the highlights. I think it spans mostly a pretty incredible breadth of topics and subjects, and there are many different frameworks you could use to organize these materials and to think about them in relation to things that we are still working through today in the scientific and public realm. But another thing that I'm doing while I'm here is public programming and educational programming. And originally we thought that I might do something around the Vichy Collection. However, there's so much wonderful public programming going on at the APS, and often that is their rotating exhibition, the new one of which just went up and open to the public on climate. And the next one is about women in science. And so I was really adamant that whatever public programming I did, it would be useful to everyone. And so we decided, instead of focusing on the Vichy Collection for public programming, I would contribute something to the Women in Science exhibition. And so we've decided to do an illustration, partly because I'm an illustrator, partly because I like to do that. And so basically how this worked is that I asked the exhibition team, which Mike is in charge of, so what would you guys like? What would be most useful for your upcoming exhibition? And so after some back and forth, we landed on sort of a diagram explaining the contributions of some early women astronomers. And this, I've done lots of scientific illustration as a freelancer, and this has probably been the most organized and quick and clear communication I've had with people before. Maybe it's because they're professional educators and so they know what they want, but it's really taught me some things I didn't know I should do before in terms of asking for specifics about what people want. So one thing Mike had us do originally was write down objectives. So I wrote some objectives for what I would produce, and they wrote objectives for the illustration. And so these were 3 of those objectives. And so as the illustrator, I read those and then I give them drafts that encompass all of the things they asked for. And so here are 3 of the earliest versions. Usually there isn't color in this kind of version, but here are the 3 earliest versions that I gave them that we sort of talk through to talk about the differences in styles and ways you could present information like this. I won't go too into detail unless I guess people have questions about why they look different and the different pros and cons of each. But the one we ended up going with is the one on the left. And then here is sort of the next stage, which most of which is not drawn by me. It's mostly pictures, but this is where we sort of work out composition. We'll talk a little bit about style and about like how much of each person's body or head do we want in the image, and what kind of font do we want, and does this placement good? And so we hammer out details a little bit further, and then I will do all of the original drawing digitally for the final product. And hopefully that will be useful to them in the future. And that's it.
Amazing. I'm so excited to see these drawings. This is the first that I'm seeing them. So lovely to see this work as well. Thank you so much, Anna. I'm so thrilled just to see the breadth of materials that you've not only uncovered during your time at the APS, but also, you know, how much you've learned in the process of being here. So we have lots of time for questions. So we have some really wonderful ones that have already been submitted, but I invite folks to ask away. And I'd also like to invite Mike Madeja to join us now to be part of the conversation. So I don't know, Anna, if you want to take down your slides. Okay, beautiful. So maybe just to start, kind of thinking big picture in terms of things you learned. So you talked a little bit about some of the surprising things that you learned in the course of processing the collection. But maybe you can talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that came with working through this material, just to give folks at home a sense of what it was like coming at this as a historian first and not as an archivist.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm sure that there were lots of challenges, and I had really excellent guidance from the professional archivists who have been here for many, many years. And I am so in awe of what they do all the time and all of the work it takes. I think the biggest challenge in terms of actually doing it, besides that it takes a long time, is deciding how to arrange it, because there are lots of patterns, obviously, that you could do, but there is no right pattern. And so as a historian, I suggested some ways that I thought would be most beneficial for someone like me to use this collection, but it didn't necessarily jive with the best practices or the ways that archivists might do it. And neither of us are technically wrong. But there's like a very strange balance between like, how efficient can we be? We can't spend forever organizing this, though we would love to, but also how does it like make sense for a certain audience? So something between like, knowing what the most optimal way to do it without having a clear answer, I think was very challenging.
Great. Lots of questions coming in, so apologies. I'm juggling several screens. Can you give us a sense of the scope? So you talked a little bit about some of the kind of challenges and decisions you made about in the organization. So if you can give us more detail about the framework that you did decide in organizing the collection, and then also about the scope, can you give us a sense of how much of it is based on material from Germany, how much is based on work that he did in the US, just to kind of give folks a sense of what's there?
Yeah, so there is not a ton of stuff from Germany, and what we have from Germany is generally like travel, like more personal documents, like travel and banking things, which will be redacted, and sort of correspondence back home to some collaborators, which might be important, but I can't read. I tried to learn German once and then COVID happened, so I stopped. But if someone might find some interesting things to his letters, to his like advisors, he had some pretty serious advisors in Germany in zoology, who I'm very much blanking on right now. But most of it is when he gets to the United States, most of it is scholarly in nature. I think the most important decision that we made was how to organize the data, in terms of like, we could have organized it by material. So like there's feathers and there's charts and there's like pictures and photographs. So picking like, should we do it by organism? Should we do it by year? Should we do it by type of experiment? Should we do it by like subject matter? Those were all questions we asked. And I think the most important thing to say is that we didn't end up doing it by subject matter, because I think subject matter is quite subjective. And so what I would consider to be separate subjects, maybe they did not at the time. And so I thought that was a bad idea, and maybe just like a good general rule. So I think we ended up doing it by organism, which will be useful for some people and probably annoying to some other people. I don't think you can make everyone happy.
So one of the things I really love about your work on this collection, and you alluded to it a little bit in your remarks, is how Vichy is sort of spanning this transition moment in the history of biology. And you can sort of see it both in how he's approaching his own scientific work, but also through the illustrations. And I know that you've done prior work at the Marine Biological Laboratory, that you're fairly deep into this field. So can you give us sort of a sense of what you what you can glean from going through Vichy's papers about how the history of zoology, embryology is changing, and how that's impacting the way that he's approaching either his illustrations or his data collection, or both.
Yeah, I think there's like, again, I'm not a Vichy scholar and I'm not sure, but it seems like there's a weird, it's not a tension, but in the beginning, it's quite image heavy and it's quite observation heavy. And it seems like drawing what's happening to Vichy is a very important part of his process. And a lot of his data, there's like numbers, and they take hormone readings and they write those and they keep very detailed track of them. But like with those in like the margins and with papers like stacked behind them that look a lot less official than the tables, he has lots of little sketches of the organism and of organs. I mean, I assume they're not labeled. So it seems like those things were part of his thought process in terms of him trying to gauge day after day how developmental changes are occurring. And so it seems image heavy in the beginning, but then I feel like at the later and later, images become less important in some ways, and it's more about like charts and graphs of like showing how numbers change over time. But I think this is a very interesting person and field to observe this kind of thing with, because it is so observation driven. When you're making claims about development of body parts, it is often like a visual argument, like, look, you can see that this is now more like an ovary than it is like anything else. And so yeah, that is present throughout for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a good transition to tackle some of the many questions about illustration and additions in the Q&A. But it's also something that you and I have talked about a lot between the process and the product and the kind of iterations of creating all of these things. So do you get a sense of Vichy's evolution as an artist across all of these things, or even are there multiple editions of illustrations for things like the textbook even?
So the textbook, no, it seems like we have like the final proofs. So if there were drafts before these, I didn't see them. So that's one thing, but does it change? He clearly started out very good. He doesn't get worse. It seems like maybe as he moves on in his career and he gets busier, it's less about producing. It almost seems like there's a lot of joy and care and pleasure in like the early drawings, and at the end it seems very much like a quick thought process based skill that he uses to do his observations, rather than like something he has time to pursue because he loves it or whatever. But his drawings become less and less detailed, and I don't want to say abstract, but much more sketchy. So it's clear like these were done hastily. They were done to like kind of make visual mental notes almost because of how they were organized with data, which is, I think, a good way to, I mean, again, like, I don't know for sure, but that is the sense you get with how the collection was put together.
So there's some interesting questions in the Q&A too about, again, kind of going back to the choices that you made in processing the collection. Question in particular about conservation protocols that you followed with dealing with the feathers and other animal parts. And I don't know, I know you had an opportunity to work with our conservation department. I'm not sure if you talked about that explicitly, but it would be great to hear you kind of talk about those conversations and what you may have learned thinking about conservation treatments that go into processing materials as well.
Yeah. Conservation are my heroes. They're in a very long time ago, I thought I was going to go into art restoration and conservation, but it's so cool to meet people who do that, but for scientific materials. It's just like so many like Venn diagrams of jobs that I wish I could have. And so it was always so fangirly to work with them. But I had them come I didn't have them look at the feathers explicitly. The advice I got was to just put them in folders, which was a great improvement from just loose in a box. So they are they're flat, so they won't crumble anymore, and they are all contained, which I think is better. But the most interesting objects were the illustration drafts, because they were these like multi-layered, many thin papers on top of each other. It's a good thing that they were on cardstock, because that makes them more durable than just a bunch of loose, thin paper. And they're in boxes, and there's good handling protocols. And definitely when we write up sort of the description of what's in there, we would give instructions to somebody coming to the collection, like, hey, in these 4 boxes, these objects are very fragile. You want to move through them in a particular way. So there is a lot of like, they are well kept, and if no one ever touched them, they would be fine. It will be up to the people coming in to look at them to take care. And so like giving explicit instruction is an important part, I think, of conservation, which I didn't really put together before, but yeah.
Echoing the love of conservation and just the amazing, the amazing work that it is. There are 2 questions that are really singing to my heart in particular. There's one about the children's book that you mentioned in the beginning. How common was it for someone like Vichy to actually do something like that? And did he have a particular focus on public science education? But at the same time, do you find any lecturing materials or other kind of teaching materials in the collection that might even focus on the illustrations?
Yeah, so no, there are no other parts of the collection that focus on illustration. I don't know how common it is for a scientist like him to produce a book like that, though he did produce it while he was a school teacher. So for some time after his PhD, he moved back to Switzerland and was a teacher in gymnasium. And so it seems like at that point, he was very involved in student education because that was his job. And so I think he certainly had an interest in illustration. He certainly had an interest in sort of like science and natural things as a thing to observe, which would have been common for that culture at that time. But I think the extent of his public outreach after he moved to the United States, he did talk at a school once. There's like record of like a letter where the school's like, you should come talk to our students. So he did that in Iowa at least once. But other than that, it was a lot of talking to the press. So I think like I saw more press articles for him than I've ever seen for like any scientist. So that was common.
So really great question here from one of your fellows, Molly Nebbiolo, who says, Anna, having gotten to know Emil Vichy the past few months, how would you think he would react to the way that we at the APS hold, process, and will study his work, especially with the documents around Vichy the human, as well as Vichy the scholar and scientist?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And we have some of the documentation. Vichy didn't donate his things to us. It was donated to us by one of his last student, whose stuff we also have. And John Opitz, who was also a developmental biologist. He was more of a doctor, like a physician. And I don't know how he would feel. I think he would like how I'm treating his images generally. I feel like a very strong kinship to him as an artist, because it is just so clearly so central to his whole scientific practice, even if at the end of the day, like most of the things that people will want to read are his publications and his textbook for the words and not for the pictures. So I think he'd appreciate that. I'm not sure how he'd feel about the personal things. There's nothing super scandalous. He seemed like a well-liked, respectful person. I don't know, but it is quite interesting, Molly, how you like come to like make this picture in your mind of who this person is just based on materials. And it's very difficult to know whether or not that's right, or if it's true at all. But yeah, being thoughtful about how that impacts you while you're organizing it is probably a good thing to reflect upon.
Just as a follow-up, do you have any sense of whether or not he sort of shaped the arrangement? Was he involved with the clippings and organizing that, or was that a family member? Did you get any sense of that?
No, I didn't get a sense. It seemed like someone had tried to organize it before who was not him. John Opitz wanted to organize some projects around Vichy's materials and Vichy as a person and writing biographies. And so we assume that he did some of the organizing. It also seemed like maybe, I think this collection was given to the APS around a decade ago. And it seemed like maybe somebody started to go through it then. It might have been Charlie. I don't know. He didn't say anything. Yeah, right. That's like a weird issue, is you don't really know whose hands have influenced sort of the arrangement already. I think some of the data was definitely arranged by Vichy in terms of like, oh, if it's like rat 20, like I don't think John Opitz went and collected all the things for rat 20. I think it's probably just existed the way they were. So yeah, a weird tension between keeping things the way they were, assuming that somebody wants them that way, versus making them usable and findable. It's hard.
So we're quickly running out of time, and I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about the fellowship program in general in your experience. So, what after being here for 4 months, what are some of the things that you wish that more people knew about the APS's history of biology materials, or really the APS's collections more generally?
Yeah, I mean, I wish they knew they were here. And I have told Adrianna, I have told everyone, and don't worry, I'm spreading the good news. And people are very surprised to learn that about this place. But I think that, so one, I wish people knew it was here. Two, I wish people knew it was here because Philadelphia itself is such a rich history of science city. Like you have the consortium right there, you have Penn. And so beyond just like learning about the collections here, just like having people outside of the APS to talk to about this and about the field of history of science in general is such like a rich opportunity. And like being embedded at the APS means that you have like so much to offer people beyond just like, oh, like I'm a scholar and I'm visiting. Like, no, like I'm a scholar, I'm here, but like you should come here too, because I think you'll find a lot of good things here for your work. And it's just like the subject matter is so broad, the kinds of things you have. It's just like extremely surprising. Like I didn't know you had the Barbara McClintock papers. I knew somebody had them, but like I found out after I got here. And so, yeah, I think I wish people knew how to search better for things in archives. But sometimes it's hard to know what you want until you know what you want. But yeah, I'll just stop talking now.
So I think one of the things I really enjoyed about this process and this new kind of take on fellowships is this focus on both scholarly programming and making something accessible to a scholarly audience, but clearly making something accessible to a non-scholarly audience at the same time. And there's a beautiful serendipity about you working on the Vichy papers at the same time, which he had that clear focus as well, from the publicity to the illustrations. Did you find yourself constantly thinking about this duality between the scholarly programming aspects and outreach that way, where like you want scholars to know about the collections of the APS, but then the additional work of the illustrations? Like, how did you balance that, and how did you think about that?
Well, the way that the fellowship was set up, I think they were pretty separate, and intentionally so. And maybe the next time, I mean, I'm not sure that that was a bad thing, especially because this public programming we ended up doing was not related to the Vichy collection. But if they were on the same subject, it might be helpful to do those things simultaneously, because you would be thinking about both. And I think I was encouraged to do that, but when we ultimately decided not to use the Vichy collection for public programming, it was sort of like separate. So that's a good thing for all of us to learn. But I do think, as you're sorting through a collection, if your ultimate goal, like at the APS, it is to do outreach and to bring people in and be inclusive, then honing in on points of the collection while you're doing it. Like maybe even in like the archive searching guide, not that I super expect the public to use it often, but like highlighting things the public might be interested in within the guide and not just scholars could be something interesting, because I don't think that happens very often. But
so this is a great segue to a question I have for Mike, which is, what did you learn through this process about our history of biology materials? Because I know you and I had dreamed about this for some time, but what was your takeaway from this?
It's a continued thing of just never never set an expectation when somebody starts going through a collection in any way. When I first heard about the Vichy collection in particular, I was like, okay, sure, this is going to work. This is, So I had no context. I didn't know. And then finding out everything that Anna found in the multiple tendrils, that from social history, cultural history, illustration, the number of possibilities for bridging the history of science collections into other kind of basic descriptions and ideas and educational opportunities within that are really endless in so many different ways. So I was just kind of floored by the possibilities of one collection in the history of science in particular to embody all of that in so many different ways.
So we've been talking for a while now, and I'm so glad that so many people have attended this. But I guess just to kind of bring things to a close, you're leaving us in a couple weeks. You've got your dissertation ahead of you. You've got your career that can take many different avenues at this point. How has your time here kind of shaped the way that you're thinking about what you're going to do after this, either in terms of your scientific illustration, your scholarly work? What are kind of the larger career takeaways for you after this fellowship?
Yeah, well, before I got here, I had I had worked with a library, but I hadn't really done intensive archive work myself. I've done exhibits before as an artist and as a science historian, but I guess I'd never done it in an institution like the APS, where like that is just the focus. It's not like a side component. And so I learned that keeping in mind museums and archives is a place to do like active work. Like when you think of a museum, you think of an archive, you think like very internal, very like individual goes to work, doesn't like finds what they need to find, they go continue their work, and maybe someday they'll like put it out there for people to see. But I think here there's a really seamless integration between doing the work and making it visible to everyone here who is also interested in it, and everyone kind of globbing on and being like, okay, this is great, let's like put it out there in these many ways, I think is just like incredibly generative, and also like somewhat important as a scholar to always be thinking about how to collaborate and how to put those things out there. And so an institution like the APS is excellent because that is like a requirement and not just like maybe something you think about later. And so I will definitely take that with me for the rest of my time, as like, okay, how can I always be engaging people with material that matters for them and for society? Yeah.
Well, Mike, I feel like we did our jobs on this one. Thank you so much, Anna, for being such a joy to work with. I'm gonna make gallery view happen so everyone can see us. Thank you all for attending. We hope that you'll take an opportunity to spend more time with our History of Science collections. Please tell your colleagues, your students, your friends about the really wonderful things that can happen with just one collection. So good luck, Anna. We hope you'll come back. Thanks again, Mike, for all of your help. And we'll see you all here, online, in person in the future. All right. Take care, everyone.